When my mom died, my dad promised to protect me. He just never said from what. The night I missed one exam, he burned my Harvard letter, told me I'd work as a maid, and deleted my future with a single click. I disappeared for 3 months, then came back with proof that destroyed his reputation, his career, and his voice. I'm Clara Bennett, and this is how I turned silence into justice. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. When I was 13, the hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. My mother's hand was smaller than I remembered, pale and cold in mine. The machines beside her blinked quietly, indifferent to the fact that the world was ending for me. She turned her head, eyes soft even through the pain. "Promise me something, Clara." She whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "Don't let anyone take your dreams from you, not even if they say it's for your own good." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what she meant. A week later, I did. Her funeral was on a gray afternoon in Lexington, Massachusetts. The church smelled like lilies and rain. People from my mother's school came holding umbrellas, saying things like, "She was so talented, and she had such a kind soul." My father, Richard Bennett, stood beside me in his black suit, stone-faced. When the last guest left, he exhaled sharply and muttered, "It's over. We'll be fine." Then he walked straight into her art studio and began taking her paintings off the walls. "Dad, wait. Those are Mom's," I said. "She doesn't need them anymore," he answered without looking at me. "And we don't need reminders. It's time to move on." That night I heard the crackle of a fire in the backyard. Through my bedroom window I saw him burning some of her canvases, the orange light flickering against the cold sky. He didn't cry. He didn't say her name. Years passed. By the time I was 18, the house still looked the same, but it no longer felt like home. The silence had a texture, thick, sharp around the edges. My father had changed. Maybe grief did that to him, or maybe it revealed what had always been there. He controlled everything: the Wi-Fi password, the thermostat, the grocery list, the amount of money I was allowed to spend. Each Sunday he'd sit at the kitchen counter with his laptop and say, "Hand me your receipts." I'd slide over a few crumpled pieces of paper, coffee, bus pass, notebooks, and he'd tap the calculator like a judge tallying my worth. "Every cent counts," he'd say. "Discipline makes success." Sometimes he'd glance up from his wine glass in the evenings, watching the news about markets or property prices. "Dreams don't pay bills, Clara," he said once, swirling the red liquid in his glass. "Remember that before you start chasing something useless." I'd smile politely, pretending to agree, but inside I kept hearing my mother's last words. Upstairs in the back of my closet, I kept a small wooden box. Hers. Inside was a half-finished knitted scarf, soft blue wool still threaded through the needles, and a torn letter from 1997. It had Harvard's crimson seal at the top. Only half the page remained, but I could still read the words. "We are pleased to offer you admission." The rest was gone, burned, or ripped. I didn't know. My mother must have kept it hidden. Sometimes I'd run my fingers along the rough edge of the torn paper and imagine her at 18, sitting where I sat now, dreaming about a world beyond this house. One night in early spring, I came downstairs after finishing a scholarship essay. The house was dark except for the light in my father's office. He was on the phone, voice calm and clipped. "Yes, I reviewed the accounts. The college fund remains frozen until I authorize otherwise." I froze in the hallway. He hung up, looked up, and caught me staring. "What are you doing up?" he asked. "I couldn't sleep," I said. He leaned back in his chair. "You should get some rest. Big day tomorrow." "What big day?" "The one where you finally learn that not everything is meant for you." He smiled faintly, but there was nothing kind in it. Later that night, I heard the click of his office safe. When I peeked from my doorway, I saw him slide in a folder marked with my name, Clara Bennett, college finances, then shut the door and spin the lock. He noticed me watching. "Go to bed," he said, "and stop worrying about things that don't concern you." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of finality. I went back to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the house breathe. The clock ticked, the pipes hummed, and somewhere below, I heard my father pour himself another drink. I looked at the wooden box again, at the letter half burned, half saved, and the unfinished scarf coiled like a secret. I thought of my mother's voice. "Don't let anyone take your dreams from you." In that moment, I understood exactly what she meant. From then on, every essay I wrote, every late-night study session, every plan I made for my future, I did it quietly, hidden. Not because I wanted to lie, but because in this house, truth had a way of getting burned. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the blinds, cutting stripes across the floor. My father stood by the door buttoning his shirt. He glanced at me briefly. "You'll be 18 soon," he said. "You should start thinking practically. About what? About the kind of life that's actually possible for someone like you." He adjusted his tie, closed the office safe, and said without emotion, "You're not going to make the same mistake your mother did." What mistake was that, I asked, though. I already knew the answer. He paused at the door, looked over his shoulder, and said softly, almost kindly, "Believing that dreams matter." The door shut behind him, and the house went silent again. Monday mornings in Lexington always felt colder than they should. The air carried that heavy kind of quiet that only winter knows. I left the house before sunrise, pedaling my bike through the mist-covered streets, my backpack bumping against my shoulders. The world was still asleep, and for a moment I could almost pretend I didn't live in that house, the one filled with rules receipts and unspoken tension. Cambridge West High sat at the end of a long road lined with bare trees. Inside, lockers slammed and sneakers squeaked down the hallway. People talked about weekend parties, football scores, and college acceptances. I walked through it all like a ghost. Somebody once started calling me Ice Girl. It stuck. I heard it whispered in the cafeteria, in the hallways, even in the girls' bathroom. I didn't correct them. It was easier to let them think I was cold than to explain the truth. I wasn't frozen. I was surviving. In AP Literature, Mrs. Grayson returned our essays. "Excellent work, Clara," she said, smiling. "You have a real gift for empathy." I smiled back, small and polite. Empathy didn't help at home. At home, empathy got burned. After the final bell, I climbed back on my bike and headed toward Maple Street, where Mrs. Helen Mitchell lived. Her house was the kind that looked like it belonged in another decade. Peeling white paint, a porch swing, a mailbox shaped like a birdhouse. She was 79, a widow, for nearly 15 years, and the kindest person I knew. "Afternoon, sweetheart," she said, as I wheeled my bike up her driveway. "The printer's at it again. I swear technology hates me. It just needs patience," I said, crouching beside the printer. "And maybe new ink." She laughed, the kind of laugh that warmed a room. "You sound like your mother." The words caught me off guard. Nobody ever said that anymore. "Did you know her?" I asked quietly. "Only from the art fairs," she said. "She was radiant. You have her eyes." I swallowed hard and focused on fixing the machine. "Thank you." When the job was done, she handed me a small envelope. $20 an hour, just like always. I shook my head. "You don't have to." She pressed it into my hand. "You've earned it, dear. Don't argue with an old woman." I smiled and tucked it into my pocket. She noticed my hesitation and asked, "Does your father know you're working here?" I hesitated. "No, he thinks I don't need my own money." Her expression softened. "Then let's keep this between us." By the time I rode home, the sky was turning pink behind the clouds. I hid the envelope inside the back cover of my chemistry textbook, the one he never touched. Dinner was silent except for the sound of forks against plates. My father finally spoke, his tone casual, but sharp enough to cut. "Have you thought about college?" "Yes," I said carefully. "I'm considering Harvard." He looked up from his plate, smirking like I'd told a joke. "Harvard doesn't take dreamers, Clara. They take legacies and geniuses. You're neither." My stomach tightened. "My grades are good. My SAT." He waved a hand. "Grades don't make people successful. Money does. Stability does. Maybe you should look into something practical. Community college, secretarial work. I'm not sure that's what I—" "Don't argue," he interrupted. "You'll thank me one day." I stared down at my plate. Voiceover, I had learned early that arguing was like pouring gasoline on a fire. The flames always won. A week passed. School chores, work at Mrs. Mitchell's. Each day a quiet loop of pretending. Then one evening I came home and found my father sitting in the living room holding something. An envelope. My stomach sank before I even recognized it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, holding it up. I froze. "That's mine." He tore it open, pulling out the cash. $20 an hour, he repeated mockingly. "What are you doing cleaning houses? You want to be a maid now." "I help Mrs. Mitchell after school." It's honest work. It's pathetic, he snapped. You live under my roof, eat my food, and you sneak around behind my back like some kind of criminal. I felt my hands shake, but I forced my voice to stay calm. It's not about money. I just wanted to buy my own books. He laughed bitterly. Books? Of course. Because reading about life is easier than living it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. Look at me when I'm talking to you. I lifted my eyes. For a second, I saw the man who used to lift me onto his shoulders at parades, who once built snowmen with me in the yard. But that man was gone. He tossed the envelope onto the coffee table. If you want to play servant, go ahead. Just remember, education's not for people like you. It's wasted on dreamers. He turned and walked into his office, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking echoed through the house. I sat down on the couch, staring at the envelope, the edges crumpled under his grip. I wanted to scream, to throw it at the wall, but I didn't. Instead, I gathered it up, smoothed the paper flat, and tucked it back into my bag. Silence was the only weapon I had, and the only one he could never take from me. That night, I sat by my window, watching snow fall under the streetlight, and whispered to the dark, I won't be like her because I have to. I'll be like her because I choose to. Somewhere downstairs, I heard the safe door close again. December came colder than usual, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. I spent most nights at my desk, the glow from my study lamp, the only light in my room. My second SAT was in 2 days, and I was determined to raise my score. I kept my notes in color-coded binders formulas, on index cards, taped above my desk, a schedule pinned beside my bed. My father called it obsession. I called it survival. The fee for the test, $80, was hidden in a shoebox under my bed. I'd saved it dollar by dollar from my work with Mrs. Mitchell. Each time I added a bill, I whispered to myself, one step closer. I'd already printed my admission ticket, checked my pencils twice, laid out my clothes for the next morning. It was supposed to be the day everything turned, but fate doesn't ask permission. At 11:47 p.m., my phone rang. Mrs. Mitchell's name flashed on the screen. When I answered, I heard her voice trembling. Clara, honey, I fell. I think I broke something. I can't get up. I didn't hesitate. I threw on my coat, grabbed my bike, and pedaled through the snow. The roads glistened under the streetlights, slick and dangerous. When I reached her house, she was lying near the bathroom door, pale and shivering. It's okay, Mrs. Mitchell, I said, kneeling beside her. I'm calling 911. Don't bother, she gasped. I'm not leaving you like this. I dialed anyway. The dispatcher's voice was calm. Mine wasn't. Within 15 minutes, the paramedics arrived, loading her gently onto the stretcher. I followed the ambulance to the hospital, stayed until the doctor assured me she'd be fine. When I stepped outside, dawn was breaking pale and silver. My phone read 6:02 a.m. The test started at 7. I ran to my bike, pedaling as fast as my legs could manage. Snow fell harder, blurring the world. My fingers froze against the handlebars. By the time I reached the testing center, the parking lot was nearly empty. I sprinted to the entrance, breath coming in sharp bursts. The doors were locked. A security guard inside shook his head. Test started 15 minutes ago, miss. Can't let you in. Please, I said, banging on the glass. I just need a few minutes. Rules are rules, he said simply, and turned away. I stood there, snow melting into my hair, watching the light flicker across the sealed doors. When I saw my reflection in the glass, I didn't see a failure. I saw a girl who never even got the chance to try. When I finally made it home, the smell of coffee hit me before I saw him. My father was at the kitchen table, laptop open, reading an email. He didn't look up. You missed the test, he said. His voice was even calm. Too calm. I didn't answer. He clicked his tongue. Do you know what this means? Yes, I whispered. I can take it again. He laughed softly. Of course you will, because apparently you have endless chances to disappoint me. I stood frozen in this doorway, wet snow dripping onto the tile. You're just like her, he said, still staring at the screen. Excuses. Always some noble reason for failure. That's not fair, I said quietly. He looked up, then his eyes like flint. Fair. You want fair. Life isn't fair, Clara. The sooner you learn that, the less it'll hurt when the world proves me right. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag. I was helping someone who needed me. And what did that get you? He snapped. An empty score sheet and another wasted opportunity. He rose from his chair and started toward the sink when something caught his eye, an envelope peeking out of my jacket pocket. Before I could react, he reached over and pulled it free. "What's this?" "Nothing. Just school stuff." He tore it open. The crimson crest of Harvard flashed under the kitchen light. He read aloud slowly. "Congratulations. We are pleased to inform you." His voice trailed off. Then, without warning, he ripped the letter clean down the middle. "Stop!" I lunged forward, but he held it out of reach. "Why are you doing this?" His face twisted fury, and something darker underneath. "Because this," he held up the shredded paper, "is a fantasy, and fantasies make fools out of people like you. Education is wasted on you." He tossed the pieces into the fireplace and struck a match. The flame caught instantly, curling the paper into black ash. I watched it burn, the Harvard crest disappearing in seconds. "You want to be useful," he said coldly. "Go clean tables. At least that's honest work." I stood there still as stone, the smell of smoke thick in my throat. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. He wanted a reaction, and I wouldn't give him one. He turned back to the table, poured himself another cup of coffee, and said almost casually, "You'll thank me someday." I looked at the fireplace. The last fragment of the letter glowed orange before crumbling into nothing. In my head, I heard my mother's voice again. "Don't let anyone take your dreams from you." But she hadn't warned me what to do when it was the person you loved most holding the match. I went upstairs and shut my door. The smell of smoke followed me. On my desk, my practice tests were stacked neatly beside my notes. I stared at them, at the hours of effort now meaningless. When I finally sat down, my hands were trembling too hard to write. I whispered to the empty room, "If I speak, he'll just burn the words too." So I said nothing, because saying anything wouldn't save the dream already turning to ash. 2 days later, my eyes stung from exhaustion. The world had gone slightly out of focus, chalk dust floating in sunlight, the soft drone of a teacher's voice that I couldn't follow. Every time I blinked, I saw the image of that letter turning to ash, the edges curling like dying wings. The bell rang, shrill and sudden. As students filed out, someone called my name. "Clara, can you come to my office for a moment?" It was Ms. Evelyn Carter, our school counselor. She stood by the door, her expression gentle but serious. I gathered my books and followed her down the hall. The guidance office always smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Usually I felt safe there. That day, I just felt nervous. Ms. Carter motioned for me to sit. Her desk was cluttered with college brochures and files, but the phone on it caught my attention. The call light was still blinking red. She picked up the receiver, pressed a button to end the line, and slowly set it down. "I just got off the phone with Harvard's admissions office," she said. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "Harvard." She nodded. "They were calling to confirm why you withdrew your scholarship. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. What?" "They received an email from your family account 2 weeks ago," she continued, sliding a printed sheet across the desk. It said, quote, "Clara Bennett has decided to decline the offer." My hands went cold as I picked up the paper, my name, my address. Even the timestamp looked familiar, but the words weren't mine. "I didn't send this," I said quietly. "I didn't think so." "Ms. Carter said, they called because they wanted to make sure it wasn't a mistake. I asked them to forward the email headers for verification." She hesitated, then reached for her phone again. "There's something else you should hear." She pressed play. A man's voice filled the small room. "My daughter isn't college material," it said, smooth and confident. "She has other plans. It's better this way." It was his voice, my father's. I felt my throat close up. How did they... "The call was logged by Harvard," she said softly. "They record all communications for verification. This was from your home number." I couldn't speak. I just stared at the phone like it was still burning. My mind replayed the scene. The fire, his hands, the letter disintegrating in the flames. He hadn't just burned it. He'd erased it. "Ms. Carter reached across the desk and took my hand. "Clara." "Look at me." I looked up, eyes blurry. "I believe you," she said. "You're one of the brightest students I've ever had. This isn't the end of your story, not if we can help it." Her words cracked something inside me. He always said Harvard wasn't for people like us," I whispered. "I thought he was just being cruel, but he made sure it came true." Ms. Carter shook her head. No, he made sure it looked that way. There's a difference. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. What can we do? I'm going to email Harvard admissions, she said. Already opening her laptop, we'll request a security audit of the account that sent this withdrawal. If the login came from your home network, that's proof of unauthorized access. Once we have that, we'll contact the superintendent. I stared at her, disbelief and gratitude tangled inside me. Why are you helping me? She smiled, small but fierce. Because someone once helped me when I was in your place. And because you deserve better than this. I wiped my eyes quickly, embarrassed. He'll find out you called them, I said. He always finds out. Let him, she replied. I'm not afraid of bullies. She typed for a while, the sound of keys filling the silence. Her email was short, precise, professional. I watched the cursor blink at the end of the message before she hit send. Now we wait, she said. I nodded, but my chest felt heavy. Wait, for what? For Harvard to call back, for my father to explode, for the truth to matter. The clock on her wall ticked loudly, every second stretching thin. She studied me quietly. Clara. Are you safe at home? I'm fine, I said automatically, though my voice betrayed me. If he's ever angry, if you feel threatened, you call me. Anytime, day or night. I nodded again. My fingers dug into the edge of the chair to keep from shaking. When I stood to leave, she said my name one more time. You didn't do anything wrong. I wanted to believe her. Walking back through the hall, the noise of the other students felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. My locker slammed shut too loudly. Someone brushed past me laughing, and I flinched. The late afternoon light cut through the windows in long golden bars. It looked warm, but I couldn't feel it. I reached the bike rack outside and gripped the handlebars, breathing in the cold air until it burned. I didn't need anyone to promise to protect me. But when Ms. Carter said we'll fix this, something inside me shifted. For the first time since my mother died, I realized that maybe I wasn't completely alone. Back at home, the house looked the same. Tidy, perfect, suffocating. I passed the office door where the safe sat behind the painting. My father's voice echoed faintly from inside, calm, composed, like a man who believed he'd already won. Upstairs in my room, I sat at my desk, staring at the blue scarf folded beside my textbooks. The yarn was still tangled in the needles, the last stitch unfinished. I thought about Ms. Carter hitting send on that email, her hand steady, fearless. Somewhere deep inside, the first spark of defiance flickered again. Maybe it wasn't over. Not yet. The house that night felt heavier than ever. The walls seemed to press closer, the air too still to breathe. My father sat in the living room, watching one of those sitcoms with fake laughter that always sounded wrong in our house. The canned joy filled the silence, like static. I walked past him toward the stairs, careful not to make eye contact. Planning to report me, he said, suddenly, his tone sharp but low, as if the words themselves were a secret. I stopped for half a second. What are you talking about? He didn't look away from the screen. Don't play dumb. Your counselor's little investigation. I know everything. My hands clenched around the railing. She just wanted to verify the email. He turned his head slightly, the glow from the TV outlining his face in blue light. You think I don't know what happens in my own house? You're lucky I didn't pull you out of that school the minute your mother died. I swallowed hard. Then why didn't you? He finally looked at me, eyes cold, because I wanted to give you a chance to prove me wrong. Guess what? You didn't. For a moment, I thought he might stand up, but instead he turned the volume up louder. Laughter erupted from the screen again. Someone else's idea of happiness. I went upstairs, closing my door quietly, even though my heart was hammering. My hands were shaking when I sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and logged into my email, desperate to see if Harvard had replied to Miss Carter. But the inbox wouldn't load. Then a message popped up. This account no longer exists. I tried again. Same result. I switched to the recovery page, typing in my address, my security question, every code I remembered. The final message appeared in bold. This account has been closed by request of guardian. I just stared at the words. He had done it. Again. I moved to the school portal next, typing my username, then password. Invalid credentials. I tried the backup. Nothing. I clicked forgot password, but the reset email went to the same deleted account. Every path looped back to him. He hadn't just burned my acceptance. He'd erased me digitally neatly, like deleting a file that no longer mattered. He'd always believed control was love. Maybe in his mind, this was his way of keeping me safe. Locked away, silent, contained. The glow from the computer reflected in the window, turning my reflection pale. He didn't just burn a letter, he burned the air I breathed. With a few clicks, he turned my future into smoke. I closed the laptop and opened my drawer. Inside was the wooden box that had belonged to my mother. I lifted the lid. The faint scent of lavender still clung to the scarf she'd been knitting. Blue wool, soft and unfinished. The yarn wrapped around my fingers like a pulse. Next to it was an old notebook. I flipped it open, pen hovering above the page, but the words wouldn't come. Everything I wanted to say felt too heavy to write. After a long minute, I managed only one line. April 15th, 2023. He burned my letter, but I still have my hands. I closed the notebook, holding it against my chest. Outside, wind pressed against the window pane, rattling the glass. Somewhere downstairs, I heard his footsteps cross the kitchen floor, the faint clink of a glass being set on the counter. I thought about the night he burned Mom's paintings, how he had stared into the flames like they were cleansing him. Maybe that's what he thought this was, purification. But all I could see was destruction. The clock read 1:37 a.m. I lay down but didn't sleep. The silence wasn't peace anymore. It was a wall between us, thick and soundproof. When the sky finally lightened, I dressed quietly, stuffing my notebook into my bag. The floor creaked as I walked down the stairs. My father was asleep in his chair TV, still on a half-empty glass on the table beside him. I slipped out the front door. The morning air was damp and gray, a thin drizzle softening the edges of everything. I pulled my hood up and started walking toward school, my shoes splashing in shallow puddles. The streets were nearly empty, the world muffled. Every step felt heavier, but it also felt like distance. Distance from the house, from his control, from the silence that had swallowed me whole. The rain picked up fine needles against my skin. I kept walking, watching the sky turn a pale silver above the rooftops. The silence between us wasn't calm anymore. It wasn't safety or respect. It was war, and I was done pretending I didn't know which side I was on. By Monday, the news had already spread. Whispers floated through the hallways before the first bell even rang. I could feel them before I heard them. Eyes flicking toward me, conversations stopping mid-sentence as I passed. Her dad filed a complaint, someone murmured near the lockers. He's suing the school or something. Yeah, another voice said. He got the counselor suspended. I didn't look at them. I just kept walking head down, clutching my books like a shield. But each word felt like a tiny cut. In homeroom, Ms. Grayson avoided my gaze. Usually she smiled when she handed back essays, but today she just placed mine face down on my desk, her eyes darting toward the door as if someone might be watching. By third period, I couldn't take the staring anymore. I slipped out before the bell, heading toward the guidance office, but when I reached it, the door was locked. A printed sign hung on it. Counseling services temporarily unavailable. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window. The room inside was dark. Ms. Carter's nameplate had been taken down. He'd done it. My father had found a way to silence her, too. I skipped lunch that day, sitting outside behind the gym instead, watching my breath fog the air. I kept wondering how far he'd go, how many people he'd crush just to keep control. After school, I rode to Mrs. Mitchell's house. The air was sharp, the first flakes of snow starting to fall. When she opened the door, her smile faded as soon as she saw my face. "Oh, honey," she said, ushering me inside. "You look like you've been through a storm." "I think I am the storm," I said, trying to laugh, but failing. She poured me hot tea, lemon and honey, and let me sit in silence until I could breathe again. The old clock on her mantel ticked softly. Finally, she said, "You want to help me with the attic boxes?" "It'll take your mind off things." We spent an hour sorting through stacks of books, yellowed papers, and old photographs. The attic smelled of dust and cedar. At the bottom of one box, I found a folder wrapped in a rubber band. It wasn't Mrs. Mitchell's. It was my mother's handwriting. "Where did this come from?" I asked. Mrs. Mitchell peered over her glasses. "Your mother left a few things here before she passed. I forgot all about them." I opened the folder carefully. Inside was a torn envelope, Harvard's crest printed on the corner. My breath caught. The letter was dated 1997. The bottom half was missing, but the first line was still clear. "We are pleased to offer you admission. I stared at it for a long time, tracing my fingers over the faded ink. She'd been accepted. My mother had once stood exactly where I did on the edge of a dream, and he had taken it from her too. When I looked up, Mrs. Mitchell was watching me. "You have her determination," she said softly. "But you'll need more than that. You'll need protection." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my bag. "I need to show this to Ms. Carter." I thought she was suspended. "She still has her phone," I said. Later that evening, we met in her car, outside the closed school. Snow fell slow and steady, coating the windshield in white dust. Ms. Carter looked tired, but her voice was steady. "What did you want to show me?" I handed her the torn letter. She read it, eyes widening. "Your mother was accepted to Harvard. He must have stopped her. Maybe that's why he's doing this now. To stop me the same way." Miss Carter sighed, shaking her head. "The past repeats itself until someone breaks it." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Let's find out the truth." The call connected. "Harvard Admissions, this is Dr. Liu speaking." "Hello, this is Evelyn Carter from Cambridge West High School," she said. "I'm calling about a scholarship issue for a student, Clara Bennett. Her acceptance was marked as declined, but she insists she never withdrew." The woman on the other end paused. "One moment, please." The seconds dragged. I could hear the muffled tapping of keys through the line. Then the voice returned. "Our records show the withdrawal email came from the parent's account associated with the application. The timestamp was March 20th at 11:18 p.m. I felt the air leave my lungs. "That was him," I whispered. Ms. Carter squeezed my arm. "Can you confirm the IP address?" "Yes. It originated from the home network listed on file." She thanked the woman and ended the call. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The snow outside had thickened, blanketing the streetlights in soft halos. Finally, Ms. Carter said quietly, "Your mother had a dream. He took it from her. But this time he won't win." Her words were strong, but her face betrayed fear. She was risking her job just talking to me. I looked out at the snow and said, "He'll come after you next." She smiled faintly. "Then we'll make sure he fails." When I got back to Mrs. Mitchell's house, she was waiting with a blanket over her shoulders. "You shouldn't be out this late, sweetheart," she said. "I needed to see Ms. Carter." Her eyes searched mine. "Did you get answers?" "I got proof," I said. "And I got something else." "What's that clarity?" Mrs. Mitchell nodded, as if she'd been expecting that answer all along. "Then listen to me carefully, Clara. You can't wait for him to change. Men like that don't. You need to free yourself." "Free myself how?" She hesitated, then said, "There's something called emancipation. It means you can live independently, make your own legal choices. You're old enough. You've proven yourself." The word felt strange in my mouth. Emancipation. "Yes," she said. "You've already done most of the hard part. You survived him." I looked at the torn letter in my hands, my mother's dream bleeding through time. I understood then. Sometimes survival meant leaving the people who swore they loved you. Sometimes, to stay alive, you had to walk away from family and call it freedom. The snow kept falling outside, silent and endless. It was late March, the kind of spring night that still felt like winter, quiet, brittle, full of ghosts. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my room, surrounded by papers spread out like battle plans. The Harvard letter from Ms. Carter's email. The old acceptance from my mother, dated 1997 printouts of every message proving what he'd done. I plugged in a small silver flash drive and began to copy everything over. Each document that transferred felt like insurance, like proof I still existed. The door creaked open behind me. "Clara." My stomach turned cold. I spun around, the laptop still glowing on the carpet. My father stood in the doorway, expressionless. He wasn't drunk. That was somehow worse. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. "Homework," I said too quickly. He stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me." I reached for the laptop, but he was faster. He grabbed it from my hands, flipping the screen toward him. The files were still open. Emails, scans, Harvard's crest. His jaw tightened. "What the hell is this? Give it back!" "You went behind my back," he said, voice rising. "You think you can make me look like a monster?" I stood up. "You don't need my help for that." He froze. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. "Give it back," I said again. "You don't have the right. I'm your father," he snapped, stepping closer. "I have every right." He slammed the laptop shut and hurled it to the floor. The sound of cracking plastic filled the room. The screen went black. Something in me snapped with it. "You did the same thing to her," I shouted. "Didn't you Mom had a Harvard letter too? And you took it from her?" His eyes widened for just a moment before he looked away. That was enough. The silence between us confirmed it. "She could have had a life," I said, voice shaking. "And now you're trying to bury mine too." "Stop it," he said, but his voice broke. "You don't know what you're talking about." I took a step back. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Then it happened. His hand flashed out faster than I could think. The slap cracked across my face, sharp and hot. The world blurred. For a second, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the thud of my heart. Then instinct kicked in. I grabbed my jacket from the chair, darted past him, and ran. "Clara," he shouted, but I didn't look back. The night air hit me like ice as I tore down the street. I didn't stop until I reached Mrs. Mitchell's porch. My hands shook so badly I could barely knock. The door opened, light spilling into the dark. "Oh my God," she whispered when she saw the red mark on my cheek. "Come in, honey." She pulled me inside and guided me to the couch. "What happened? I can't." My voice cracked. "He found out. The letters, everything." Her face went pale. "Stay here." She reached for the phone. "No, please don't." But she'd already dialed. "Yes, I need to report a domestic incident," she said firmly. "Address 214 Maple Drive. The daughter's safe here with me." When the police arrived 10 minutes later, I watched from the window as red and blue lights painted the street. My father stood in the yard arguing with the officers, hands raised. "It was just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm, again practiced. "A family argument." She overreacted. One of the officers shook his head. "Sir, we've received a call from a witness and can see damage to property. You'll need to keep a 100-foot distance for 72 hours. My father's mask cracked then, just slightly. "You can't tell me how to raise my daughter." The younger officer stepped closer. "Sir, it's called the law. They didn't arrest him, but they made him leave. I watched him climb into his car, headlights flashing across the window. Our eyes met for one brief, terrible second, then he drove off into the night. When the street went dark again, Mrs. Mitchell locked the door and turned to me. "You're staying here," she said. "No arguments." I nodded. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. She brought a damp cloth for my cheek and wrapped me in an old quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and tea. "You're safe now," she said softly. "He can't hurt you tonight." But safety felt strange, like a language I'd forgotten. Hours passed. The house settled into silence, the kind that comes after storms. I sat on the couch, staring at the flicker of the lamp across the room. Somewhere in that quiet, my phone buzzed. It was Ms. Carter. Her voice on the other end was trembling, but not from fear. "Clara Harvard just confirmed it," she said. "The scholarship was never revoked. They traced the fake withdrawal to your father's email." "They're investigating." I didn't answer. The lump in my throat was too big. "Clara." "I'm here," I managed, my voice breaking. "Everything's going to be okay," she said. "You're going to get your future back." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at my hands. They were small, pale, shaking, but they were mine. For the first time, I realized how much power that meant. The first fire had taken my dreams. The second had burned away my fear. Sometime past midnight, I opened my notebook on the coffee table, the lamp's yellow glow warming the page. I picked up my pen and wrote slowly, carefully. "For the first time, I see light that doesn't come from fire." Then I closed it, turned off the lamp, and let the darkness settle around me like something finally earned. A week later, the courthouse in Middlesex County smelled faintly of old wood and rain. I sat between Ms. Carter and a young attorney from the community legal clinic, a woman named Rachel, who couldn't have been more than 28. Her briefcase looked too large for her small frame, but her eyes were sharp, confident. "You'll be fine," she whispered. "You just tell the truth. The rest will take care of itself." The courtroom was nearly empty except for the clerk, a few observers, and the man sitting on the opposite side of the aisle, my father. He wore a dark gray suit, his hair slicked back, his jaw clean-shaven. He looked like someone giving a business presentation, not a man who had burned his daughter's future. His attorney. A tall man in a navy tie leaned over occasionally to murmur things that made him nod, composed, practiced. He didn't look at me once. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. This court will now hear the case of Bennett versus Bennett regarding the emancipation petition. Judge Henry Wallace announced. He was in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-framed glasses. Rachel stood. Your Honor, my client. Miss Clara Bennett seeks legal independence from her father, Mr. Richard Bennett, due to repeated emotional and financial control and deliberate sabotage of her education. My father's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor. These are exaggerated claims made by a confused minor. My client is a respected citizen of Lexington with no history of abuse. This is simply a family disagreement blown out of proportion by outside influence. He glanced pointedly at Ms. Carter. The judge raised a hand. Let's proceed with evidence. Rachel nodded and clicked her laptop. The first video appeared on the screen behind her, a recording from Mrs. Mitchell's porch camera. My father stood in our backyard, the Harvard envelope in his hand. He poured lighter fluid, struck a match, and dropped it. The paper caught fire in a burst of orange. For a long moment, no one spoke. The crackle of the flames filled the room from the speakers. I watched the back of his head on the screen, familiar yet foreign. Then Rachel played the second clip, the one from my bedroom camera, where he hurled my laptop to the ground. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. When the video ended, Rachel said quietly, This is the man who claims to be protecting her. My father's lawyer objected. These are isolated incidents taken out of context. Context, Rachel cut in. The context is a 17-year-old girl losing her Harvard scholarship because her father impersonated her, and withdrew it. The judge looked toward Ms. Carter. Ms. Carter, you were involved with the school's handling of this matter? She stood composed but visibly tense. Yes, Your Honor. I verified the Harvard admission myself. When Clara's acceptance disappeared from the system, I contacted the university. They confirmed a withdrawal email sent from her family account and a recorded phone call from her father stating, She glanced at me. My daughter isn't college material. The judge nodded. Do you have that recording? She pressed play on her phone. My father's voice filled the courtroom. Calm, measured, undeniable. My daughter isn't college material. She has other plans. It's better this way. The sound faded into silence. My father's lawyer started to rise again, but the judge raised a hand. Sit down. He turned to me. Clara, would you like to speak? My heart hammered, but I stood. My voice was steadier than I expected. Your Honor, I don't want to hurt my father. I just want to live without being afraid. I want to go to college. I want to choose my own life. Why do you believe emancipation is necessary? He asked. I took a breath. Because I want to live the life my mother wasn't allowed to live. The words seemed to hang in the air. My father finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes. That wasn't anger. Maybe fear. Maybe regret. But I didn't look away. Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. This court finds sufficient cause for emancipation. Miss Bennett, from this moment, you are legally independent. You may manage your own finances, education, and residence. Mr. Bennett, you will have no further authority over her. The sound of his gavel was soft but final. Ms. Carter reached over and squeezed my hand. You did it, she whispered. I could barely nod. My knees felt weak, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. Behind us, I heard my father's lawyer murmur something about appealing, but Richard didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the desk. Outside the courthouse, the air was warm, almost summery. The sky stretched blue and endless above the old brick buildings. I looked up, blinking against the sunlight. Ms. Carter smiled beside me. You're not under his control anymore. For the first time in months, I smiled back. I know. We stood there a moment longer, the courthouse doors closing behind us with a quiet click. It felt like a sound I would remember for the rest of my life. The sound of something ending. That evening, I packed my things into a small suitcase. Clothes, notebooks, the scarf my mother had started knitting. I slid the flash drive into the inside pocket of my coat. At Mrs. Mitchell's house, she'd prepared the guest room, fresh sheets, a lamp on the nightstand, a cup of chamomile tea waiting. "Long day," she asked gently. "The longest," I said. She smiled. "Freedom's never easy, but it's worth it." Later, I sat at the desk by the window, the night breeze carrying the faint scent of rain. I opened my journal and wrote May 10th, 2023. Freedom doesn't come to those who stay silent forever. I closed it and turned off the light. Outside, the first fireflies of the season glowed softly in the dark. 3 days after the hearing, Mrs. Mitchell called me into the kitchen. She had that careful look she wore when she didn't want to scare me. "Sweetheart," she said, holding her phone. "You should see this." She turned the screen toward me. It was an email from one of her friends at the neighborhood watch group. The subject line read, "I think this is your neighbor." Attached was a short video file. I pressed play. There he was, my father in our backyard, standing over the fire pit lighter fluid in one hand, the Harvard envelope in the other. The flames caught in seconds, bright and violent. The sound of the paper crackling filled the kitchen like a ghost. Mrs. Mitchell set the phone down. My camera picked it up that night. I didn't realize until now. "Do you want me to delete it?" I stared at the screen, my chest tight. "No," I said quietly. "Do you want to make it public?" The question hung in the air. I thought about it, what it would mean, what it would cost. Then I shook my head. "I don't need to say anything." She smiled a little. "Then maybe it's time for the truth to speak for itself." That night, she sent the video to a friend who wrote for the Lexington Chronicle, a small but widely read local paper. By the following week, my father's face was everywhere. The headline hit on a Tuesday morning real estate agent hides daughter's Harvard scholarship. The article included screenshots from the video snippets of the emancipation ruling and quotes from the court transcript. Someone must have leaked the details, but I didn't ask who. I didn't want to know. Within hours, the story spread across the local network, picked up by neighboring towns. On social media, people commented faster than the site could refresh. Some posts were angry, some pitying, all of them curious. "Unbelievable," one read. "Imagine sabotaging your own kid's future. He always seemed so perfect at those neighborhood meetings," another said. "Guess not." At his office downtown, the calls started coming in. Clients canceled contracts. Listings were pulled. By Friday, the company's name had been taken off the window. The Massachusetts Real Estate Board released a statement 2 days later. "Mr. Richard Bennett has been suspended indefinitely pending review for unethical conduct." When I saw the notice online, I didn't feel triumph, just a strange stillness like the echo after thunder. Karma doesn't need anger, it only needs exposure. Once truth comes to light, it burns quietly, without smoke, without mercy. That afternoon, I received an email from Harvard College admissions. For a long moment, I just stared at the subject line, reinstatement of scholarship. Clara Bennett. When I opened it, my vision blurred. "Dear Miss Bennett, we are pleased to confirm your admission to Harvard College for the class of 2028. Following the resolution of the administrative error, your full scholarship of $280,000 over 4 years has been reinstated. We look forward to welcoming you this fall." I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. "Ms. Carter called the next day, her voice bright with emotion. "You did it," she said. "You're officially back on their list. Harvard wants you." "No," I said softly, looking out the window at the spring sunlight. "They always did. I just had to stop someone from erasing me." Ms. Carter laughed through a sniffle. "You know they reinstated me too. The board dropped the suspension. You're back officially. And the superintendent offered me a permanent position as senior counselor." I smiled, feeling warmth creep into my chest for the first time in months. "That's amazing, Ms. Carter." "You can call me Evelyn now," she said. "You've earned that right." That evening, Mrs. Mitchell baked an apple pie, her kitchen filling with the smell of cinnamon and butter. We sat on her porch, the sun dipping low, painting the rooftops gold. She cut 2 slices, poured sweet tea, and handed me a fork. "So," she said, "are you ready to start thinking about Cambridge?" I laughed. "Not yet. For now, I'm just trying to remember how to breathe without fear." She nodded, taking a small bite of pie. "Do you think he regrets it?" The question lingered between us, carried by the hum of cicadas and the rustle of the maple trees. Maybe I said finally, "But silence can be a kind of answer too." Mrs. Mitchell looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's wisdom talking." The streetlights flickered on one by one as the last streaks of daylight faded. I sat back in the rocking chair, letting the wood creak beneath me, my fingers resting lightly on the table's edge. Across the street through the trees, I could see the outline of my old house. The windows dark, the driveway empty. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a closed chapter. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from a nearby barbecue. For a moment, it reminded me of the fire, the burning, the sound of paper turning to ash. But the memory didn't sting anymore. It just was. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the silence. I watched the last of the light fade over the rooftops and whispered to myself sometimes, peace sounds exactly like this. June 25th, 2023. The air shimmered with summer heat, and the football field behind Cambridge West High had been transformed into a sea of blue and gold. Rows of folding chairs gleamed under the sunlight. Banners flapped lazily in the breeze, and families filled the bleachers with umbrellas and handmade signs. I stood near the stage, my gown brushing against my ankles, the tassel of my cap tickling my cheek. In my hands I held the blue scarf, my mother's unfinished gift. I'd kept it with me through every storm, every courtroom, every sleepless night. Today it was finally part of the ending. When my name was called, the applause came in waves. I crossed the stage, shaking hands with Principal Martin, who smiled like he'd been waiting for this day, almost as long as I had. "Congratulations, Clara," he said quietly. "You earned this." "Thank you," I whispered. As I took my seat again, the student speaker before me finished their remarks about perseverance and community. Then, Principal Martin returned to the microphone. "Before we close, we have one more address," he said, "from a student whose journey reminds us that courage often grows from the hardest soil. Please welcome Clara Bennett." The applause roared again. My knees trembled as I walked to the podium, the scarf still wrapped tightly in my hands. The microphone felt too close, too loud. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I looked out at the faces in front of me. Friends, teachers, families, people who had seen the headlines, who knew parts of my story, even if I'd never told them. In the back row, I saw him, my father, sitting alone, his head lowered. The sun glared off his hair, highlighting the gray that had crept in since winter. He looked smaller somehow, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I took a breath. People talk a lot about success. I began, my voice steady, about grades, awards, and colleges, but sometimes what defines us isn't what we earn, it's what we survive. A murmur moved through the crowd. Soft, attentive. For a long time I continued. I thought silence was strength. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could keep the peace. But silence doesn't keep peace. It only protects the person who breaks it. I glanced down at the scarf in my hands. The truth is, it's not achievement that defines you, it's honesty. It's the courage to speak even when your voice shakes. It's believing in your own worth, even when no one else does. The breeze lifted the edges of the gown around my legs. I stand here today. Not because I'm smarter or luckier than anyone else, but because people chose to believe in me. A teacher, a neighbor, a friend, and maybe a mother who never stopped believing even after she was gone. My throat tightened. I smiled anyway. So if I could leave you with one thing, it would be this. Don't let anyone tell you what you're capable of. Don't let fear become your family tradition. The applause that followed wasn't loud or chaotic. It was steady, full warm. When I stepped off the stage, Ms. Carter, Evelyn, was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She hugged me so tightly I thought I might disappear into her shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Your mom would be too." "I know," I said softly. As the ceremony ended and families began taking photos, I lingered near the edge of the crowd. That's when I saw him approaching. My father moved slowly, shoulders stooped, as if the weight of the world had finally settled on him. He stopped a few feet away, eyes fixed on the ground. "Clara," he said, voice rough. He didn't finish. Maybe he couldn't. I met his gaze for the first time in months. His eyes were tired, rimmed with something that might have been guilt, or maybe just exhaustion. "I forgive you," I said quietly. He looked startled. You do. I forgive you, I repeated. But I'm not coming back. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but no sound came out. After a moment, he nodded, then turned and walked toward the parking lot. I watched him go without sadness, without anger, just distance. Mrs. Mitchell waved from across the field, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. I walked toward her, my shoes crunching on the dry grass. As we drove home, the late afternoon sun flooded through the windshield, golden and endless. Forgiveness wasn't for him. Forgiveness was how I kept the best parts of my mother alive inside me. That evening, Evelyn met us at a small diner on Elm Street. The place smelled like fresh coffee and pancakes. A banner on the wall read, "Congratulations." Graduates written in red paint and glitter. Evelyn slid into the booth across from me. "You know," she said, stirring her iced tea, "Harvard doesn't know what's coming. You're going there with the strongest weapon anyone can have." I smiled, which is self-respect. I laughed softly. "And maybe a half-finished scarf." "Finish it," she said, "for her." Later that night back at Mrs. Mitchell's, I sat at the desk by the window, the soft yellow light pooling around me. The blue yarn slipped through my fingers thread by thread, the rhythm slow and calm. Outside, fireflies flickered in the garden, small beacons in the dark. I tied off the final knot, looked at the scarf stretched across my lap, and whispered, "Done." My hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from relief. For the first time in my life, I felt complete. September 2024. Arrived with the sound of bells echoing across Harvard Yard. The air smelled like wet leaves and coffee, like new beginnings. My dorm room was small. Brick walls, wooden floors that creaked when I walked a narrow window overlooking the courtyard where students hurried between classes. I unpacked slowly, careful with the things that still felt fragile. The scarf folded neatly at the bottom of my suitcase. The flash drive tucked inside a small envelope. And a small pot of white chrysanthemums that I placed on the windowsill. My mother's favorite flower. I didn't bring hate with me. I brought a promise. To live fully, to build something from what was left. Classes began early. I enrolled in psychology, a subject I'd always wanted to study but never dared to under his roof. My advisor suggested I start thinking about a long-term research topic. I already knew what it would be, the effects of parental control on young adults. The way love, when twisted by fear, becomes a cage. Every lecture hall felt like a kind of freedom I hadn't known existed. I learned to take notes, without watching the clock to raise my hand, without worrying what voice might cut me down. One afternoon in late October, a thick envelope arrived at my dorm. It was from Lexington General Hospital. I frowned, breaking the seal. Inside was a single-page letter. Patient Richard Bennett, minor stroke, partial speech impairment, temporary, condition stable. For a long time I sat on the edge of my bed, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. I read the letter again and again until the words lost meaning. The radiator hummed softly. Outside leaves spiraled in the wind. He was alive, but silent. I folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of my desk beside my journal. Then I closed it. I didn't call the hospital. I didn't visit. I didn't even tell Mrs. Mitchell right away. Justice doesn't always come in loud, cinematic ways. Sometimes it arrives quietly like an exhale after years of holding your breath. He had taken my voice once. Now life had taken his. That night I sat by the window looking out at the lanterns glowing across the courtyard. Students laughed in clusters below their voices, soft and distant. I didn't feel joy or revenge, just a strange, calm stillness. For the first time, the silence didn't hurt. It soothed. A week later, Mrs. Mitchell called, "Clara, honey." She said, her voice gentle, "I read something about your father. Are you okay?" "I'm okay," I said, and I meant it. "You don't have to be strong all the time, you know." I smiled faintly. "I'm not being strong. I'm just breathing. Finally breathing." She chuckled softly. "That's all I ever wanted for you." After the call, I sat for a long time, listening to the steady hum of campus life. The faint music from a dorm down the hall, footsteps on the stairs, laughter echoing through the courtyard. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Silence isn't fear anymore. It's peace." Then I turned off the light and left the desk lamp glowing by the window. The scarf rested beside it, the blue yarn catching the warm light. Outside, the chrysanthemums swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Somewhere in Lexington, a man who once spoke too loudly now sat in quiet. I didn't need to see him to understand. The universe had already answered in its own way. And for the first time I believed that peace wasn't the absence of sound. It was the absence of pain. Boston, January 2033. 10 years had passed since the day I left Lexington with a suitcase, a scarf, and the kind of silence that used to frighten me. Now it was the foundation I stood on. I was 27, an author, a speaker, someone people introduced with words like resilient and inspiring. But in quiet moments, I was still the girl who once watched her future burn in her father's backyard. The auditorium was full that afternoon, sunlight cutting through the tall windows, warming the old wooden floors. The banner above the stage read, "Forgiveness as Power, Annual Psychology and Healing Forum." I adjusted the microphone, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes waiting for me to speak. Behind them, a stillness I knew well, curiosity, empathy, maybe even recognition. I smiled. When my mother died, I began. I lost half my heart. And the day my father burned my Harvard letter, I lost the other half. The audience leaned forward, quiet as snowfall. For a long time, I thought silence was weakness. I said, I thought speaking up was the only way to fight back. But I've learned something else. That silence can also be strength. It's not about surrendering. It's about choosing peace over vengeance. I paused, glancing at the copy of my book resting on the podium, its title printed in silver, The Second Flame. In my book, I continued. I wrote this line, "There are fires that destroy, and there are fires that illuminate." I chose the second one. The room was so still I could hear someone's pen drop in the back row. I looked across the crowd, faces of students, teachers, survivors of their own quiet wars. I could almost feel their stories pressing against mine. When we choose to forgive, I said softly, we don't excuse what happened. We simply refuse to let it own us. Forgiveness doesn't erase the fire. It just teaches us how to carry the light. When I finished, there was no immediate applause, just silence. The kind that breathes. Then the clapping started, soft at first, then swelling until the room filled with it. Afterward, people lined up to shake my hand. Some thanked me. Some just cried and didn't need to say why. Toward the end, a woman in her 40s approached. Her eyes were red but steady. "Your story." She said it reminded me of my daughter. We haven't spoken in 2 years. I took her hand gently. "Then maybe today's a good day to start." She nodded, tears catching the light. "What should I tell her?" "Tell her the truth." I said, "Tell her that no matter how far she runs, truth always finds its way home." She smiled through her tears. "Thank you." When the auditorium emptied, I gathered my notes, slipping the scarf, still soft and blue, back around my neck. It had faded over time, but I liked it that way. It felt lived in, real. Outside, Boston was humming with early autumn energy. Street musicians played near the common leaves, brushed the sidewalks like quiet applause. I walked slowly through the square, the evening sun painting the city gold. On my way to the parking lot, I passed through Harvard Yard. The gate stood just as I remembered it, the inscription carved in stone. "Enter to grow in wisdom." I stopped beneath it. My reflection caught in the brass plaque. I looked older now, but my eyes still held the same question that had carried me through everything. Who do I want to become? A breeze moved through the trees, scattering a few white petals from the chrysanthemums planted near the gate. I picked one up, twirling it between my fingers, before letting it fall. Forgiveness, I thought, isn't about forgetting. It's about making peace with the memory. Somewhere back in Lexington, I knew my father was still alive, older, quieter. He never spoke again after his stroke. I never saw him. But sometimes I imagined him sitting near a window watching the sky. Maybe in that silence he'd finally found what neither of us could before. Understanding. I turned toward the gate, the scarf brushing against my arm, and whispered the line I'd written years ago. If you ever choose silence instead of revenge, you already understand. Justice doesn't always speak. Sometimes it listens. The lights around Harvard Yard flickered on warm against the dusk. I walked beneath them, the sound of laughter and footsteps echoing faintly behind me. Now it's your turn. Have you ever chosen silence to take back your power? Have you ever realized that peace can speak louder than anger? Tell me your story. I'll be listening. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.